Hello and welcome to episode 218 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien, Faye and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, how are you doing?
I'm good, Andy. We're both good, aren't we?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Both our football teams had great results this week. Andy, I joked on Twitter before this podcast that I had to try and get him down from cloud 9 in order to actually record this podcast, because Watford, as most of you who are into football already know, have made it to the FA Cup final, and Andy, of course, was there. So you were buzzing, weren't you?
Yeah, literally buzzing. We called the Hornets, so that's quite apt, actually. Yet 2-0 down, came back to 3-2, and I didn't have a voice for 2 days, so I wasn't in work Monday and Tuesday. I'd already booked them off, but I wouldn't have been able to record the podcast because I was still very hoarse. But it was amazing.
We'll share some of Andy's videos from the day when he was celebrating, because they did make me laugh. And of course, Tottenham returned to their home ground, and I was there this week for the very first time, which was a fantastic night. We beat Man City, but enough of the football, because we are not a football podcast.
We're not.
So we've had a number of you write in, which has been fantastic. I asked you to write in after last week's podcast, particularly relating to the event that we did the previous week, and a number of you have. And we're going to start off with a piece of feedback we got on one of the pieces we did last week, the train fare delays.
That's it, yeah. Charlie's been in touch, and we met Charlie at the meetup back in November. He's provided a bit more context to we did a bit on the delay repay, getting money back if you are delayed on the trains. And there's actually, he's brought our attention to a website. You can Google it. It's raildar.co.uk. That's raildar.co.uk. And essentially what that is, that's a tool. There's an app, or you can do it via a desktop, and you can go on there and you can check what trains were actually delayed and when, and you can actually go back in time. So for me, for example, I know I was delayed 2 or 3 times last month, and I didn't get a chance to actually make the claim, and I couldn't remember which days it was. So the software on this tool will allow you to actually go back in time and check and make it easier for you to make your claims. And Charlie has pointed out that braver people might use that software and system to manipulate the figures and work out.
To play the system. We don't condone that in any way, but I guarantee some people will be doing that. I have no doubt whatsoever. So thank you, Charlie, for getting in touch with that. Now, what's on this week's podcast? The first piece is going to relate to the new tax year. With any tax year, there always are new changes in terms of tax reliefs, allowances, or actually some new rules. So we're going to go through a whistle-stop tour of those. We're then going to go on to read a question I had about inverse ETFs. Now, these are ETFs you can use to bet against the market. So if the market is going to fall, you can use them to make money. But I want to point out some dangers that most people overlook about using that particular type of instrument. And finally, we're going to be talking about cutting bills. Now, this relates to a number of things that happened this week. Me personally, cutting some bills and my experiences. We almost entitled this piece Neil's Bills, and Neil, you remember from last week, was somebody we met at the event and who'd saved £250, I think it was, from using my money MOT. So it's a bit of a plug for that as well, but we're going to talk about some other tips, and actually some that were sent in by you guys. So one in particular that I quite like the look of, so we're going to touch on that at the end of the podcast.
Good stuff. So on to the first piece, which is about the tax changes. We're obviously in a new tax year. We're going to do a whistle-stop tour. What are we going to start with?
So before I start this piece, I just want to point out that we are going to put a list on the website, moneytothemasses.com, that will have a bit more detail on some of them, and probably one or two we won't actually get time to talk about. Now, the first thing that's happened is the tax-free personal allowance has increased for income tax from £11,850 to £12,500, and the higher rate allowance will increase from, or has increased from, £46,350 to £50,000.
That higher rate tax has really shifted on the last couple of years. It's we've seen some steady increases. So people sort of on medium to higher incomes are actually seeing some proper pounds and pence savings on these things.
Yeah, and it also falls in line with the level whereby your child benefit starts to be reduced if you earn over £50,000. So it makes it quite easy to remember. On to inheritance tax. Now, there's been a change in inheritance tax. Now, you may know that there's a basic nil rate band, which is equivalent to £325,000, which we each have. But there is an additional rate that applies to property that's passed on to direct descendants. Now, last year it was £125,000. It's increased to £150,000, which means that the overall tax-free allowance, including both parts, is now £475,000. So if you want to pass on assets to descendants. It does mean that a married couple could pass on a total of £950,000. Now, you may recall that the aim of the original piece of legislation was to be able to pass on £1 million without any inheritance tax, and that increase that will take it up to £1 million will happen next year. Moving swiftly on to pensions. Now, the lifetime allowance, which is what most people will never encounter, but the lifetime allowance on pension contributions has increased from 1.03 million to 1.05 million, which is a limit that people or pensioners can accrue inside their pension without incurring any additional taxes. If you have anything above that level, then it can be taxed at a rate of 55% if you take money out of your pension. Now, sticking with pensions for a second, you will remember that a couple of weeks ago I did a podcast on the increases to the auto-enrolment contribution levels. So if you're employed, what this means is that you're going to have to now pay 5% of your salary into a pension, and your employer will pay 3%. So that's a total of 8% under the government's auto-enrolment scheme. I mean, you can find more information online or moneytothemasses.com, but it does mean there'll be an increase. So the concern is there will be a number of people who start to opt out of the auto-enrolment because of the jump in personal contributions. Hopefully that won't be the case, but even anecdotally I've heard of people, and Andy has as well, that are already starting to pull out because the levels have jumped over the years. But let's hope most people do stay into their auto-enrolment scheme, because the more you save, the younger you do it, the more you'll have in retirement.
Yeah, it's really not a bad thing. Some of the press out there are making it into this, big thing about everyone losing money. They're not losing money. They're gaining wealth in the long term. And if you can afford just that few extra pounds a month now, everyone will benefit in the future. So don't read all the bad press. It is a good thing overall, but I can understand some people are finding the pinch, and finding an extra few pounds now is sometimes tough.
Now, moving on to buy-to-let landlords will feel they've been attacked over the last few years by the government, but in truth they've actually just had it their own way for far too long, and they've actually removed the amount of mortgage interest rate relief that they've enjoyed, and we're on the next phase of that removal. So landlords used to be able to claim the interest paid on their mortgages as a business expense to reduce their tax bill. Now they will only be able to claim a quarter as tax deductible, and it's going to be completely removed from next year. And I don't think there's any coincidence that we're seeing a rise in first-time buyers in terms of getting mortgages and buying houses, and that was deliberate by the government, and I actually think that personally is a good thing. For investors, then we had the capital gains tax allowance jumping from 11,700 to 12,000. For the budding entrepreneurs of you out there's something called Entrepreneurs Relief, which basically gives you a relief on the capital gains tax you would pay on your company and unlisted company shares. So there has been a change to the holding period to qualify for the relief, which has gone from 12 months to 24. Again, if you want to know more information, then Google it. And finally, junior ISA limits have increased from £4,260 to £4,368. But all other ISA limits have stayed the same. So there you go. That's a quick run through of the key changes to allowances and reliefs that came into effect on the 6th of April.
Find out how fit your finances are for free with Damien's Money MOT. With no registration required and no need to access policies or paperwork, you'll receive your own personal grade, together with a breakdown of where you should focus your attention, all in the time that it takes to boil the kettle. Crucially, you'll get to see how you measure up compared to everyone else, and even get your own tailored plan on how to improve your score. Simply go to mot.moneytothemasses.com. So sit back, relax, take Damien's free Money MOT, go to mot.moneytothemasses.com to get started, and reward yourself with that cup of tea afterwards.
Okay, so moving on to our investment piece of this week's pod, we're going to be looking at ETFs, specifically inverse ETFs, and it comes on the back of a question from one of our listeners or reader listeners.
I lost track because I was feeling like I was slightly stalked on social media, email by this person, and I've forgotten his name. And I love getting all your questions, but I just didn't have a chance to respond. So this is a good way to respond on the podcast. And the question related to inverse ETFs. Now, this person was wanting to bet against the market or bet that the market would fall. They're trying to protect their money should the market fall. Now, we've done something on this in the past, and I talked about ways that I work out funds that actually would benefit if the market fell. So go back and listen to that podcast. Now they're all beautifully labelled and numbered after Andy spent days doing it. They're easier to find, but there are ways you can find funds that aren't ETFs. There are funds out there that will make money if the market falls. And I was invested in one of those at the back end of last year, which benefited as the market fell. But on the whole, I don't tend to short the market as such. So the question relates to inverse ETFs. If you're an 80/20 investor member, you will start to see some of these come to the fore in the ETF section. And the way they work is they will make money if the index falls. So let's just say it's the FTSE 100. If the FTSE 100 starts to drop, then they will make money because they move inverse, hence the name, to where the index goes. Now, it's quite brave to bet on the market falling, and over the long term, which I'll explain why, you're probably going to end up losing out when it comes to using some of these inverse ETFs. A lot of the time as well, they are leveraged, which means they basically borrow money to be able to amplify the return. So you'll get a 2 times short, a 3 times short. I've even seen a 5 times short ETF. So therefore, if the FTSE goes down by a point, you'll get the equivalent of 5 times the moves. And that's quite hairy. That's very volatile and very risky, because if the market suddenly rallies, as it did at the start of this year, you'll be licking your wounds and nursing some huge losses.
So it's like an amplification. It's like doubling down on a casino table.
Yeah, and I'm seeing more and more of them. And they slightly concern me, only because I think people might not understand how they work, and they also just look at the overall return. They'll just see suddenly that, wow, that ETF made 30% in a month. Well, the reason it made 30% because it was really betting on the market going one way. But of course, they're really aimed at short-term investing, almost like betting on where the market's going to go. They're much more short term. So trying to hold them in a portfolio that's over the longer term, they have their issues. Now, I'm going to give you an example, which you might have to focus on slightly because I'm going to chuck some numbers in, well, to illustrate the dangers of these types of investment. Now, people think that if the market was to fall, say, 20%, then you're going to make 20% in these inverse ETFs. It doesn't quite work like that because of the numbers. Now, if I give you an example, if you had £100 and the market fell 20%, then you'd have £80. That's basic mathematics. If it falls another 20%, you'd have £64. If the market then rallied 20% from there, you'd actually end up with £76.80. Now, if you take £76.80 away from 100, that means that you lost £23.20, or using percentages, you were down 23.2%. Now, you may think that if you invest in an inverse ETF, you will make 23.2% because the market's down 23.2%. Surely your inverse ETF works in the same ways. Unfortunately, due to mathematics, it won't have worked like that. And I'll explain why. Now, if you imagine the same example that the market fell 20%, that would mean your ETF goes up 20%. So you now went from £100 to £120. Now, if the market falls another 20%, your inverse ETF is going to go up, isn't it? So it will go up 20%. So you add 20% to that £120, you end up with £144. Now, to finish that same example, if the market rises 20%, so it's bounced back a bit, as it did in the first example, that means that your inverse ETF is going to fall 20%. Doing the numbers, it means you're going to end up with £115.20. Well, that's a gain, therefore, of 15.2%, which is very different to 23.2%. So it's one of the dangers of investing in these things is that people just look at what the market's doing and they're thinking they're going to get one thing, but actually, because of the way the mathematics works, they're going to get something different. And so that's why over the longer term, there's obviously charges and everything involved in these things as well. But over the long term, it's very difficult to make a lot of money from these things if you're betting on the market going downwards because of the mathematics involved. And most importantly, it will never be equal to this sort of exact inverse over the long term because of those mathematics, as I've said. And the leveraging can amplify a lot of that. So I'm always wary of them. I think anybody using them, you've got to be pretty sophisticated. You've got to know what you're getting yourself into. So
is it more on the likes of gambling or trading almost? You're really hedging your bets one way or the other, and it's quite risky. Like you say, short term, not long term kind of thing.
Yeah, but that's quite right, Andy. I think they are more speculative. They are more suited to short-term investing. I think if you, over the long term, of course, you could use them, but I think there's a danger that you could get yourself into some strife. And there's nothing wrong with taking this sort of position. But you have to realise that over the extreme long term, markets tend to go up. So if you want to go back 100 years and look at investment markets, you will see there will be some wild rallies and some incredible crashes. We saw the dot-com boom, we saw the financial crisis. Who knows, we may see one again in the future. But the general trend is always upwards over the long term. And so I think if you were going to invest over the long term in a bearish stance with an inverse ETF, you would actually just end up losing money, because one of those reasons is effectively inflation. So that's why things tend to go up. So very interesting question, and I hope people have learned a little bit to look out for. So you've got to look out for the risks and the costs.
Good stuff. I'm going to move on to the last piece, and we're covering off bills, or what we kind of titled Neil's bills. He was the guy that sort of got us thinking about this, and it just so happened it coincided with something that you did with one of your bills recently, and I did something similar. So what have we got? What are we covering?
Well, Neil's bills, I think that's a lesson in there. If you meet me and you buy me a pint, you're likely to get a section of the podcast named after you. Yeah, this came about. The money MOT, Neil saved money by going through the MOT, and it was in particular on his home insurance, I think it was. And I talk about during that MOT how you can use comparison sites, which most people know about, but I actually picked out one that I've had a lot of success with over the years and actually quite like. I'm not going to name it on the podcast. If you want to know, go and do the MOT. But the key point is that this week I sat down and I looked at my bills, and it was partly inspired by Neil, but it's also just because my annual renewals were coming up for a lot of things that I have. And it's that time of year where those annual renewals, it's cheaper to pay for insurances annually as a general rule, because there's an element of insurance that they put into those premiums. But I have to sit there and look at it, and it's one of those parts of the year I dread, because not only are all the bills come in at once, but I have to sit there and shop around. But I started getting into the swing of it. And so what I want everyone to do is effectively what I did at the weekend. I went down and picked a bill that I've had for a very long time, which it covers my boiler. And my boiler is terrible. I need to replace it, but I'm always sitting there thinking I might move house, so it's not worth it, and the cost. So I have insurance to cover it. And to be honest with you, I'm quids in on that insurance. They come out so regularly that the guy's almost got a pair of slippers by the boiler he can put on when he comes in. It's so regular. I've had it fixed. I've had it rebuilt internally about a dozen times. And every time they come out, they suck through their teeth, giving it, I'm not sure we're going to have the parts for this for much longer. You're going to have to get a new boiler. And so I've still got this boiler insurance, but each year it's been, I would like to say, creeping up.
It's creeping up because you keep using it.
It's leaping up. It's so expensive now, to the point where you start to equate, should I just get a new boiler? Anyway, the moral to this story is what I want people to do this week is I just thought, right, I'm shopping around. I'll have a quick look around. I can get this cheaper elsewhere. And I switched my energy bills, by the way, this week as well. So I'm winning. And I just thought, well, I'm going to ring them up. So I just did the simple thing and rang them up to say, my bill's too expensive. I had a feeling I knew how much I could get the bill for, how much cheaper. But like I say, my boiler is on its last legs. And the thing is, if you have never done it, it's so easy to negotiate down your bill payments or your insurances. Because my conversation largely went like this. I was wandering around the house with sort of half talking to my children, half with my youngest wanting me to be, she's into role play, pretending I was Sophia the First. And then at the same time holding a conversation with a lady about how I thought my boiler insurance was way too expensive. And then she magically just seemed to keep pulling discounts out of the hat, and I'll go away. I spent about half an hour on the phone, most of it on hold, and I didn't really ever negotiate. I didn't even sort of argue.
Push that hard.
I wasn't pushing that hard. I was too busy playing the role of Sophia the First while I was on hold, hoping she wasn't listening to me. So it really is that easy. Just do it. Pick the bill that you've got that's the largest. Ring them up and just say, look, this is too expensive, particularly if it's gone up over time. There'll be a lot that they can do where they'll just start knocking discounts off. And in the end, to give you a percentage discount, I ended up paying probably about, in total, around about 30% what I was paying previously. And the thing is, I didn't even have to go through the effort of cancelling the policy and then buying or shopping around and taking out a new one. I shopped around, knew the price I could pay. I was armed with that information. It really is that simple. So just do it. It's addictive. Once you do it, you start thinking, I'm going to ring up the next person and just say to them, it's too expensive. And so I'm slashing bills left, right and centre. I think one day my family will go home and realise, why is the telly not working? I've slashed it. We've no longer got Sky. TV.
The thing is, I think my tip really is to not be too British about it. People there and the insurance companies are expecting you to call them up and haggle. They want people who are going to give them a free, easy ride. That's how they make their money. So they're expecting you to call, and you're not doing anything that everyone else isn't doing as well. So
Yeah, and the other thing is, the reason they are keen to do it is far more expensive to get a new customer than to keep an old one. So the amount they have to pay to acquire a new customer is extortionate. I did have some figures from people who worked in the industry, but I don't think I could really share them. But put it this way, to give you a massive discount is going to save them money than getting a new one. Just think about it. If your work and you're trying to employ someone new, it's far easier, which is why people give you a pay rise when you say you're going to leave, because they suddenly think, blimey, I've got to find a new person first of all, I've got to convince them to come and then pay the agencies, all this sort of stuff. It works.
Train them up.
It works the same way with bills. To get a new customer costs money, so do negotiate. And on that, there's another piece that I want to talk about very quickly from Andy, Andy sent me a brilliant email. Andy, we met at the event last week.
And also at the event last November.
And this Andy, everybody seems to be called Andy, which makes this incredibly confusing to talk about. But Andy, as in my Andy here, who I'm sitting next to, went up to this guy, who equally I think was going up to Andy at the same time, and Andy remembered everything about him, including his name, his job, and everything like that. I think he was slightly blown away. He even mentions it in his email, and I was impressed because I'm the opposite. I remember everything about somebody, and I remember people visually, but I'm terrible with names. I mean, just try it. The next time you meet me somewhere, I am listening to everything you're saying. I could tell you anything about you, but if you introduce yourself to me, just ask me 10 seconds later, what was my name again? And then laugh at me, because I'm terrible at it. I am so bad with names. It's not because I'm not listening. I'm always like, that's not a detail I need. I'm listening to what you're talking about. But anyway, he started sharing some great information and talking about various different things. He's into wine. He buys and sells wine, which is quite interesting. But the piece I want to point out is he found a tool which he thought was really useful. If you're going to buy a car or you're looking to buy a car, replace your car, there's a tool, a money-saving expert, which will tell you which category, insurance category, your car falls into, so you can see how expensive it's likely to be. Sorry, it's not money-saving expert, it's Money Supermarket, but all essentially the same thing these days. If you go to moneysupermarket.com/car-insurance/groups, you will find it, and it will tell you which insurance group your car is in. I've just done it, and I've just found out my new car is going to be a slightly higher car insurance group, which is bad news. But the thing I did like is they have a nice table on there that shows you the cheapest car for different age groups, because obviously they are factors that influence how much insurance costs. I am on the cusp, well, I'm not on the cusp. I've dipped into the over 40s bracket. Andy is hanging on to the under 40s bracket by the skin of his teeth, but it was quite interesting. So if you want to find out more, go to the URL I've just said, and we will put it into the notes of this podcast.
Good stuff. Damien mentioned earlier as well, it's cheaper to pay your insurance annually. I know not everyone has that kind of money laying around, but I did it for the first time this year. I've always been a slave to the monthly direct debit, and this year I got my renewal and I saw how much percentage I was paying on the monthlies, and so I finally bit the bullet and paid the annual. I think not going to look back.
You're not going to look back. I think the typical saving is around 11%.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Good stuff. We're done for this week. So if you want to get in touch with Damien, do so. It's Damien@moneytothemasses.com. If you're a Watford fan, you want to get in touch with me and meet up with me at the Cup final, you can do that. Obviously, you can contact me regarding anything else. It's Andy@moneytothemasses.com. And of course, we're on Instagram and Twitter. Check us out. Search for Money to the Masses and you'll find us. And if you can rate and review the podcast and share the love, it really helps us out. We're done.
We're done for this week, Andy.
Until next time.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.